Bienvenue donc. Et on rentre tout de suite.
Welcome. Let's get straight to the subject. This geographical area across borders. How do we define this as a basin for work? We know that this involves people moving across a region, but with the president of the PC, we are going to talk about this. Does that explain what a cross-border region is? I know that he prefers talking about this differently, not just about a place of work. I'd like to hear you speak about this, Mr. President. In these areas, this part of everyday life, this revolves around work, and work where people travel every day to go to work in the neighboring country and then come home later, including people of Swiss nationality in our case, who come to work on our side of the border because it's a bit cheaper. It's true that work is at the heart of these regions, but it would be very restrictive to limit these cross-border areas to jobs. That is why I prefer to talk about cross-border areas for living, because there are jobs, of course, but there are many other ways to live in these areas. The health crisis we have experienced, particularly, this has been referred to several times already, the shock that we had living in these areas with the sudden closure of borders made us more aware of the fact that if there were no jobs and we lived on borders differently, the area we live in is an area which is economic, we're there, a family area, cultural area, commercial area, for local tourism too. It's all of these things. And this area has to exist because our future is shared, and that is more difficult sometimes. And it needs to therefore be supportive. I think these are key elements. And if we speak about an area of work, I'd like to emphasize the fact that this is essential, the appeal for people who move here looking for work. We see that every day, but it can only operate over time if in one form or another we find a good balance across the way we develop the area, how we develop the areas where people live, and if we together find a situation which is a win-win between the two countries where activities are taking place, but where the return on investment in, as we can express it, because cross-border work is an investment in another country to a certain extent. So this return on investment needs to be done as fairly as possible. I am lucky to be in a region, Genevois in France, where agreements with Geneva enable this feedback to come back. Some people may be jealous because I recognize that we've already heard this because the latest news is, and maybe I'll come back to this later because this is at the heart of the organization of our area. We have a project for our agglomeration, our urban area, to add a fourth area where the Swiss region is going to invest 40 million Swiss francs in France on structures of shared interest. And so this area, this jobs are at the heart of the problem to begin with, but it's beyond that. It is really a place for living within this area that we need to consider first of all. Mr. Lambertz, I would be interested to know the point of view of the president of the Association of Cross-Border Regions of Europe. Do you recognize what Mr. Dupessey says? Do you realize too as a member of the German-speaking people of Belgium, this cultural aspect across two countries. Is this something that you see already? Are there obstacles to carry this out? Do you feel that there are difficulties to carry out what Mr. Dupessey, as a president of these territories, feels as an opportunity? Do you feel, for example, that the capitals of each state decide? Would I dare say something about capitals when I'm sitting here in Paris? No. I would rather say how much I think this concept of the bassin de vie, the living area, is a pleasant one. And it reminds me of my own life. We all have the opportunity, in most cases, to know three generations: ourselves, our children, our grandchildren, or arranged other ways. But cross-border cooperation is more or less the same thing. First of all, we remove a barrier, a dam, a legal frontier, for example, and people look at each other no longer back to back, looking at their own capitals. And then they start to cross the border and mobility happens. And the real test is often that point when a significant quantity of citizens go to work on the other side of the border. As of that point, it becomes more adult, more serious, and then it continues. And then after a certain time, we realize that we are so compatible, we need to find things to do. We need to go further. We really need to integrate all of this much more substantially, much more fundamentally. And these are the three steps which each cross-border cooperation story goes through. And it's something that happens at the same time in lots of different places. Sometimes it happens differently in one place to another. That's the richness, the dynamic of cross-border cooperation. And what you really need to want to do is to improve and to intensify these synergies, this coexistence, this day-to-day life within this area. And that will be there forever because the problems are there. You can remove a problem, you can be certain then that it will have consequences with more people on the other side of the borders at the same time. Other problems will then arise. I compare this work with the work of a hairdresser, for example. The customers will never disappear. That is daily life in our work. There are exceptions, of course, but yeah, looking. In fact, no, there are many similarities, and we really need to create conditions for this to develop, because the value added which is created then is extraordinary. Sometimes working on the other side of living on your own side and working on the other side, you open up new avenues, particularly if there is diversity, there are differences in language or differences in social systems or cultural systems. There is a mountain of problems as well as an even larger mountain of opportunities. That is daily life with cross-border cooperation. We work to progress this, knowing that we often have challenges and we need to go back to go, but that's not a reason to despair, because we can then push to be more resilient, as we know within this conference. Thank you very much. That is the marvel of crossing borders, which is there's a destabilization between the different regions, and when you see what is happening elsewhere, you make contact that stabilizes, and you can intervene, operate on day-to-day work, and have interactions with them. So how do you organize all of this? Mrs. Verschelde, the question for you is different because you are talking about a vision, the Commission's vision, and I am interested to understand. You have heard two actors who live somewhere very strong. I think you can understand how this is how much this is holistic. So how would you react? How would you intervene where there is a zone which has to delimit one authority from another, where people don't look at that too much and live on one side or the other? How can you operate there? How can you finance projects jointly? Is that enough? Or do you need to go further? Or is there another vision, in fact? Thank you very much, Giuseppe. It's a big program indeed. First of all, let me apologize from Slavomiska, my director, who could not come to Paris today. The question of Ukraine and how to support Ukraine is taking up a lot of time for us at the moment. So it was very important for him today to stay to talk about that with other colleagues. So you say that we have the helicopter view, perhaps, but personally, I would like to say that I am from the same place as Karl-Heinz and Christian. Maybe not politically, but I am also from a border. My both grandfathers worked across borders. One went off in his bicycle, on his bicycle, the other in his car every day, clearly understanding climate change and one the other not, and came back at midday to have lunch at home and then went back in the afternoon. That's how close they were between where they lived and their work, even if one was in Belgium and the other was in France. So that gives me the opportunity to say to you that I agree with what has been said. I think that bassin d'emploi job area is too restrictive because jobs are only a small part of what is human, and we are engaged also in other aspects of life. For me, for example, personally, to talk about my own personal story, it was going shopping in France and in Belgium on both sides. Anybody who lives near a border knows what is better, cheaper on one side or the other. There was football. There was no major club in my region, so the club I supported was on the other side of the border. So I can only speak about the Commission and the Regio Directorate, which is responsible for territories. So straight away, I think we will have a multidisciplinary review of the territory, a vision which is not limited to jobs, but takes into account other aspects too. For example, mobility, which we already mentioned this morning, which is very important. For example, managing resources, natural resources is very important. Managing risks, which has to be carried out across borders. I think Karl-Heinz lived that last year with the floods, which impacted Belgium and Germany and the Netherlands more or less in the same way. So we need to take into account the territory as a whole and the people who live in these territory. I always repeat to our teams that we need to think about the citizens. We do not develop territories for the territories themselves, but for the people who live in them, who need to make it live and make it continue to live. That is why we have created. I'm working on the internal borders division, and recently we created a small group responsible for other things than Interreg, because Interreg is very interesting. I think there's a lot of things which have changed across borders because of Interreg in the last 30 years, but that's not enough. As you said, project by project is not enough. As we said this morning too, we need to institutionalize, give longer life to these links. So that's why we have the border focal points, so the contact points, if you wish, across borders, who work with all the directorates. So we have an inter-service group where we speak about questions relating to jobs, but also mobility, environment, climate, questions on Schengen as well, because we spoke about the pandemic and the disastrous impact of the introduction of restrictions across borders. So it is important for us to take all of this into account. We can't do everything. There are certain skills and not others. I also appreciate the idea of social supportive jobs, and we need to work on all aspects relating to work, education, training, recognition of diplomas. The interpreter apologizes. There is a background noise. Jobs on both sides, job services which do not always speak together, and also fiscality. We need to talk about fiscality. That's not a European subject, but fiscality must also be taken into account. The interpreter apologizes. There is a background noise which is preventing us from hearing clearly. The interpreter apologizes. There is a background noise which is making it very hard to hear. But I think that little by little, there we need to think of functional noises where people interact across the entire cross-border region. It is very interesting to speak. The interpreter apologizes. There is background noise, which is preventing the interpreters from hearing what is being said. When you live in different places, you hear it very well. I would almost like to say, what can we do to really make things even easier? What could we imagine being able to do to speak to each other about questions which are sovereign and national, for example, fiscality? How could we imagine fiscality which can be destined to these parties? I'm raising ideas a little bit randomly here, perhaps, but cross-border fiscality or a way of financing, as we heard, for example, the example of a Swiss investment in France, but that's not the same everywhere, far from it. So this solidarity needs to be worked on. Are all the players going in the same direction? I don't know if they're all going in the same direction. That would be interesting, because one thing that is certain, that we are in the same boat. We need to be in the same boat to go in the same direction. But in terms of solidarity, I think that there's a problem with fiscality, clearly. But sometimes I think that this is a problem which is so complex that promoting it systematically makes us forget. I am in favor of greater fiscal harmonization across Europe. At my level, I can do it as a militant. That I think that this is something that we need to reflect upon. But in terms of inequalities and the other aspects, how we act in a cross-border area. So the cross-border area is not necessarily somewhere where everything is going well. Sometimes it is a place, an area which creates inequalities, strong inequalities. I know that clearly because my city is considered to be the fourth most unequal city in France. When I say that to my fellow citizens, they wonder about this, but it's true. In other words, it is attractive to people with high salaries, people who are paid in Swiss francs. But since the representatives of this city have not pushed the most poor people from their social housing, we have these significant differences. So we are permanently in a situation where we need to manage these inequalities in the field, and particularly with people which are difficult to understand, because when on the same floor of a flat, somebody earns 4 times as much as somebody who's doing the same job on the French side of the border, there is jealousy. This is everyday life. They are humans, but this is complicated. So I think that in the conception of life in this area, this is about day-to-day life. And I would say that there are inequalities on the French side, but for example, in Geneva, there are strong inequalities on the Swiss side too, and the elected representatives know that too. And we need to take this into account. We can take this into account with a fairer taxation, with participation by those who benefit most from jobs compared to those who benefit least from jobs, particularly in the Geneva area, because we have a financial compensation which has a 3.4 contribution of the salary that is cross-border, that is paid to the people in the French and Haute-Savoie regions, and that is important. It gives us to address these inequalities across the area in terms of various equipments, but that also requires us to have a place for discussion and for governance too, because it is not enough to be able to have a measure which we need to have a vision over time. We are in an area, we are in territories which are changing, and we need to have a vision of these territories. We do need to understand how we want it to work. We need to consider how to make them develop with Euro districts, for example, with structures which will need further development. We don't get a GCT because Switzerland is not in the European Union, but that works properly. That manages the greater Geneva area and that unites the different districts of the Geneva city and the canton of Geneva, the city of Geneva, as well as the district. And we develop a territorial project here and we start, or at least we are trying, we have been trying for a while to rebalance jobs and housing. And we can say that we at least winning part of this. The specific nature of the Haute-Savoie region of Geneva is that it is not an economic desert. It is a place where the entire population crosses the border. In the Alsacian agglomeration, there are as many jobs as there are active population, but half of the active population goes to work on the other side. So there is travel which takes place on a larger scale. And that needs that we need to develop the territory in terms of environmental transition, which we spoke about this morning, for us to have the opportunity while respecting the choices of our states, for us to have the ability to act where we can act on mobility, where we can act on travel. As somebody said this morning, the researcher who was here this morning, I've forgotten her name, I'm sorry, but the one who was working on Seine to recover the heat from Seine. These are elements which are very concrete in the way we work. And my question is today to understand how our structures nationally and at a European level give us more power, more right to experiment, more decision making possibilities close to the populations with these words we heard this morning: simplification, deconcentration, experimentation. We often use these words, and we would like these to be much firmer, to go further where we can manage these in the field.
But these experiments have been carried out for 30 years, so we do experiments here and there. But it seems to me that locally, populations have shown that they can take initiatives. And you've said all three, the fundamental elements here is communication and the connection between populations on both sides and how they work together. And we might well wonder how can we build together something that will help populations on different sides of a border. And this is of interest to me. And I noticed, Mr. Lambertz, that you were taking notes when President Dupessey and when Mrs. Verschelde were speaking. Well, there is one thing that we talked about, not sufficiently perhaps, is the relationship with our capitals, because activities in a cross-border area are one thing, but we shouldn't forget that those activities very much depend on our capitals, on our national governments. And of course, I can't say that it's the fault of the EU, because after all, it is member states that decide on European policy. So I would like to know perhaps a little more about this. Thank you for actually coming back to a question that we didn't answer. But I have to say, with 50 years of experience as a European politician, I've got used to the idea of answering my own questions. Joking apart, the question that you raise is actually an explosive question. Why? Well, because it fundamentally affects the very conception of state sovereignty. So, of course, you can look at history in different ways. There are many sort of windows and back doors that you can enter when the state no longer helps. But it nevertheless is the case that the situation is very delicate. When you have cross-border living areas, it is not possible to structure them correctly if each state maintains its full national sovereignty, as if the cross-border area didn't exist. Now, of course, we can hope that Europe will become increasingly harmonious, but of course the limits are clear beyond the treaties. So we need to find clever ways of acting. And this idea of experimentation territories are perhaps a good idea, because it makes governments believe that they remain sovereign. But it means that they have to create the exception solution that will be applied. So how do you define a portion of national territory where these experiments can be carried out? And it is to find an answer to this problem that the Commission, under the Luxembourg presidency at the time, and it was a great idea to invent a transporter mechanism, which is a legal framework where on a particular issue, it means that in the territory of one state, you can apply the law from the other state. This is in order to be more efficient, for things to be more operational. But the whole Commission the Council of Ministers, in fact, did not, shall I say, fall for this. They actually blocked this idea. And on all sides, we're trying to change the situation, but it's very, very difficult for any state. Even in the most decentralized federal states, there's always someone who'll say, well, this is going a little bit too far in terms of our sovereignty. We need to find other ways. So I think we need to insist, because that is the solution. In a cross-border living area, such an area will be correctly developed only if more or less identical rules, certainly comparable rules, apply. In the meantime, of course, we need to act. But if you talk about land planning or tax in a cross-border area, then you can be sure, of course, that there will be disagreements. And for the Congress of Local Authorities for the Council of Europe, I carried out a study on the equitable distribution of products for cross-border workers. And I can tell you that it wasn't very easy, as you can well imagine. And of course, there are scientific conclusions, and I had to present my own conclusions. and the Prime Minister of Luxembourg attacked me, and I'm in a region that's even smaller than Luxembourg, on the border of Luxembourg. I said to the Prime Minister, "Did you actually read my report?" And he admitted that he hadn't read my report. So I said, please read it, and then we can discuss these ideas. So it's very delicate. And what you can't do with this is cherry picking. You have to have an overall view, taking into account tax issues, but pensions as well, public health, the cost of living, housing, training, education, social security, and this is actually what I was noting down earlier. This is something that could be successful if we take into account of all these factors, and this will lead to what was mentioned earlier, the right balance. Well, but I would say that land planning, it's like at a wedding. You can ask all the guests, if they're happy with the way it's going. So there will always be some people who are not happy. But what is perhaps more interesting, if you agree, I'm not sure, that the cross-border areas, could we say that they are laboratories for the future? And you said clearly, you need to focus on town planning, tax issues, and other issues too. And as a living area, you need to think also about cultural activities. And this is somewhat anticipating a discussion that will involve the whole of Europe. In cross-border areas, I would say that we are living in a laboratory, because in future, the EU countries will have to tackle tax differences, educational differences, and so on. So these are very delicate issues, but how to arrive at that point? Not only by finding a specific tool, it's a question of principle as well, of course. Can we accept that another country could fund public services in another country? Which would be a good thing, of course, in many ways, but how in that case? And what would be the common goal or vision? So this is not so much of a question, but a comment to highlight the importance of this issue. And this needs to be done, I would say, because we need to focus on this aspect of cross-border areas as a laboratory for the future. So does this give you some other ideas, perhaps? Well, yes, we can say Karl-Heinz Lambertz reminded us how difficult it is to negotiate some things with the Council, and we'd forgotten that it was a very difficult mechanism, that's true. But the idea is not to make available one or two specific tools, but a whole toolbox in the final analysis, and say that those who have a true will to work with their neighbors may have the possibility of working together thanks to the existing toolbox. And if some wish to invent their own tools, then fine, they should be encouraged. But of course, we will always be there to support them. But of course, there has to be the will to begin with. You need to have the will to work together. And the major difficulty with this is that what we offer should help all borders and all cross-border areas of the whole of the EU, which is a challenge, because we talked about specific borders with France, Switzerland, or Germany, or Western European borders, should we say. We talked a little this morning about the Nordic states as well, but we shouldn't forget that we have Central Europe and Southeastern Europe, where the recent history is a little more complex. So I can't really develop a tool that would only be applicable between France and Germany, or Belgium and the Netherlands. We need to reflect on all borders. And that's why this idea of a toolbox is fully in line with what we're trying to do, in the sense that in that toolbox you might have basic tools, but also more sophisticated tools that would enable you to do things that are a little more advanced. But at root, you need to have the will to work together. If you don't have that will, then nothing will happen. Yes, we're actually at the heart of the different challenges we have in these territories. And I believe that these cross-border areas, generally speaking, and the MOTS, of course, has indeed done this. Well, we know these territories work together to reflect on the future. But the question is, why doesn't it go further? Well, it doesn't go further because there are several obstacles. Obstacles that we can understand, legal barriers. You work on a particular territorial project with a global vision on town or land planning on over 20 years, and very often you come to an agreement if you share the same vision. But such an agreement has no impact on the development projects of both countries. And it's more possible, of course, if you have a federal country such as Switzerland. But in France, for instance, there is no way that this general framework can be included in the objectives that we're talking about, i.e. Projects that are trying to really organize the various territories. So it's here perhaps that we can actually approach states on an individual basis, not at EU level. And I come back to what we've said on several occasions already. How can we experiment further? How is it possible to decentralize somewhat sufficiently to allow these cross-border regions to experiment? If we have ideas to put forward, will you, our national government, cover us for these ideas and experiments? And then, of course, we're provided you respect the national rules. I'm very attached, of course, to the French legal framework, naturally. We're not talking about doing anything we want. I do think that we need national rules, that's true, but we need national rules that are sufficiently flexible and that trust special situations sufficiently. I'm talking about local cross-border areas in particular. And I can give you a couple of examples. An example today, a current example, the rules for teleworking. Well, everybody said, well, it's good to have those rules because it means that during the pandemic, we could all, or most of us, carry on working from home. And also, it is very positive, environmentally speaking, less commuting and so on. And today, and thankfully that various representatives, MPs and local representatives, and the MOTS also, which carried out a study on this, we are in a position to say that where teleworking was going to end completely for cross-border workers, for a provisional period, we have committed to find some rules that would make teleworking something which is more viable in future. But we need those local representatives. Otherwise, we don't have the necessary administration. And within a company, you have those who work in the country in which they work, and others who are not from that country, who come from across the border, would the same rules would not apply to them. And of course, we have to think about competition, about decentralization. There needs to be rules, of course, and limits to what is suggested quite clearly. But we should take into account the reality of cross-border areas. A second example, we talked this morning of energy transition or ecological transition. The differences existing between the discs that you put on your motor car, the tax disc, compared to in some cases, some cars can only drive on odd days and others on even days if there's heavy pollution. But in France and in Switzerland, it was very difficult to harmonize tax discs on motor cars to make sure that the tax discs in Switzerland were valid in France and conversely, and that they meant the same thing. And this is something that can only be dealt with locally, and it's got to be decided, of course, by the national government. But this permanent link between what is local and what is national indicates that there is a need to have cross-border cooperation at all levels, at local level, at national level, and at European level. We need to have that link. And hence the need, and I've said this for some time now, the need to have within each state a service or a department that is able to relay to national governments the cross-border concerns and needs. And I wish to simply add, because we're talking about a dialogue and the need to commit to a dialogue with others. Personally, for the last 10 years, of course, I've been working within the Commission in the DG Regio. The main concern is not the dialogue that is needed between one side of the border and the other, but it's the dialogue within the same country between the local, national and European level. And that's where the problem lies. Because I would say the vast majority of cross-border workers themselves get to know each other. They're able to talk to each other and they know exactly where they should go. They understand, what is a win-win situation. They have a vision for 2030 or 2050, but the problem lies when that particular vision, when you try to reflect that vision within the administrative bodies, within your own borders, and that's where the problem lies, within the hierarchy, within the administration. The problem is not, I would say, horizontal, between both sides of the border, but it's a vertical problem, i.e. that the higher bodies are aware of these issues. And when we worked on COVID, for instance, we realized that even in our capitals, different ministries within the same capital don't talk about what's happening on our borders. Or else to say, well, I consider that borders should be closed. There are health issues, teleworking issues, but no one has an overall vision in our capitals. And in my opinion, I'm not talking about France in particular, but all member states, there's not a sustained dialogue between the local, regional and national level. I keep saying, Karl-Heinz, that you are a politician, have been for the last 50 years. But do you consider that this is an issue that will continue in future and will stop that integration at a cross-border level? Well, certainly we need a dialogue. We need to talk to each other. And in particular, we need to be able to cooperate on the basis of trust. I would say that nothing is possible without trust, even within the same country. Never mind at cross-border level between different states. And the difficulty is to understand how things work on the other side of the border. Because very often you might have local authorities on the other side of the border that might even have the same names as yours, but that have other competences that operate differently, that are more or less dependent on their respective capitals. And all this has to be brought together in order to have a consistent results. And this is why we're talking about the laboratory experiments of these cross-border areas. And in 2021, the Commission mentioned this. So cross-border cooperation is not easy. It's not sufficient to will it. You need to have the know-how as well. And you need to understand in depth how the other side of the border works and see how you can harmonize things on both sides. And very often you need to make tremendous efforts in order to progress modestly, but it's only through modest progress that little by little things will change. But of course, what we lived through dramatically with COVID, and I didn't think this would have been possible. As soon as there was a problem, even if it's totally counterproductive, the reflex of our governments was to close our borders. I didn't think that this would happen. And if we do this, then that means that within 1 hour, you destroy all the work that took years, sometimes decades, to build up. And we've seen this with every crisis over the last 10 years or so. The national reflex is to shut down the borders, and we need to eliminate that risk. And in order for that to happen, we need to have something solid. And perhaps the EU should, and I'm using this words knowingly, they should impose, indeed, impose regulations that would stop nations from acting reflexively. Well, perhaps there is some ancestral fear. That means that when there's a problem, you close the border, whereas the border area is where you've been able to exchange, to live things together, indeed. So I would like to thank our three participants to this first roundtable of this afternoon.